The bark around Petrograd for miles was stripped from trees because workers were leaving their factories to go eat bark. I have no sympathy for those anarchist peasants at all.
Kulaks on horseback?
Yeah. Sorry, hand. If you've got an objection, I have a hard line stance.
It's just I'm trying to get an understanding of what the hell is going on, because I really don't know anything even about the Civil War. I don't have very much background in it, but would a fair analogy be like Puerto Rico did not? Because I mean, it was Ukraine, right? I mean, I don't know anything about it, but it seems like they're an independent nation. I don't know if they speak a different language. I have no idea, but it seems like it'd be like the same thing as, you know, Puerto Rico kind of not doing what the United States wants them to do, and then saying, "Hey, fucker," or sorry, no language, and going in there and basically killing them because Puerto Rico's not growing grain for our Civil War. Or it's not going to even benefit Puerto Rico at all.
Or hey, in Iraq, the oil in Iraq really belongs to the United States, which you hear people say all the time. Well, we need that oil, so
yeah,
we need to come kill you to take it.
There's an important historical.
Really, that belongs to us and nowhere to America.
Can I add something to the question?
May I? Oh, to the question?
Yeah. What was the nature of the relationship between Ukraine and Russia during the Tsar?
So basically what happened is, people don't realize this, it wasn't Russia, it was the Russian Empire, which actually led Lenin to call it, what is it, the prison of nations. Ukraine was not independent. My history might be wrong. Ukraine hadn't been independent since the partition of Poland in like 1783, I want to say, under Catherine. So Ukraine, like for example Czechoslovakia, had a history of nationalism, but not a history of being a nation. So, same thing with Poland. Poland is a nation that is less than 100 years old, because it was part of Russia or Germany. So Ukraine was historically part of Russia, part of the Russian Empire. And one of the Bolshevik moves, quite frequently, was to declare nations independent. Part of that was political efficacy. Part of that was just simply matter of fact. When the Bolsheviks started after the October Revolution, they controlled a thin strip of land that went from Petrograd to Moscow. I mean, they had pockets of support elsewhere, but they were really in no position to tell anyone in Ukraine what to do. They had a Red Army there. It was ultimately disintegrated because the whites targeted it. It disintegrated, and basically Makhno took up the pieces there. Actually, I mean, this is a good analogy. If you think of the United States as, right, before the Civil War, the United States, you would say the United States are a great country, or are great countries, right? Or the United States are negotiating with Britain, right? After the Civil War, it's the United States is. But if you conceive the United States as actual little states that are incorporated in a body, a more analogous situation would be if Kansas and Nebraska and the entire Midwest, and California, said, hey, you know what? We don't really like America anymore. We're not shipping any food to anywhere. Have fun with that, Phoenix. Was there national sentiments in Ukraine? Yes. Should Ukraine be given a relative amount of autonomy? Yes, and ultimately they were. Should Ukraine, that was historically for hundreds of years the breadbasket of the Russian Empire, be granted the ability to say, yeah, even though we fed you for the last 300 years through exploitation, we're not going to feed you anymore, and you have nowhere else to get food, and that's really rough for you. But if you want to send us some consumer goods, then yeah, maybe we'll let these grain trains go. Texas, Kansas, Nebraska. If we had a civil war and they declared their independence, they could legitimately do that, right? I mean, if each of the states broke up and became their own state, California would be like, sorry, Phoenix, you're not our state. You're not our problem. Die. And that's kind of what happened. Well, okay. Now I'm being a little dishonest. The dishonesty is the Ukrainians didn't intend for the Bolsheviks to starve. They didn't intend for the cities to die. They didn't intend for the famine. So I want to be clear. The Ukrainians never intended that. And so I shouldn't characterize it in that way. I apologize. However, as a matter of fact, they caused the Bolsheviks to starve by preventing the grain. Or you'll also notice this happen numerously over and over and over again through the Russian Civil War, is you'll have a rebellion that demands for free trade. And the reason why they have this demand for free trade is so that the Ukrainian or the peasants who have the grain can get free trade with the cities, who basically have nothing because the only thing being produced in the cities is basically ammunition and rifles. That's a little bit of an exaggeration, but it's not that much of an exaggeration. And want free trade with the cities. But I mean, imagine any war, any modern war in the United States. What free trade could the cities have during World War II? What was being produced besides tanks and planes and rifles and guns? And so the Bolsheviks, again, were just like, no, we need the grain. People are starving. If you don't want to give it to us, we're going to take it.
So could somebody say, oh, sorry.
Oh,
Could
yeah.
somebody say, well, as a Ukrainian nationalist, I don't have any sympathy for the people in those cities starving because
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
they're not approaching it the right way either because, you know, they shouldn't even be
Yeah, well, but I mean, here's an important distinction.
supporting a state that would potentially destroy them as well.
Yeah, I understand that, and I
They
see
do
that.
the same thing to that city if
Well, I mean, this is, again, I mean, not to be overly critical, this is where I call for moral sophistication. It's one thing to say, we're going to take your surplus grain, but you can still feed yourself. It's another thing to say, you can't feed yourself. The Bolsheviks were more than willing, again, to leave the Ukrainians with enough to feed themselves and their families and to sow for the next season. It was the Ukrainian peasants, and this is well documented. It was the Ukrainian peasants, primarily, there were other peasants who also did this, who stopped growing as much. They literally intended only to grow for themselves. They literally started hiding all their surplus of food. That seems unjustifiable to me. I mean, if, it goes back to Barack Obama in the United States. If the Bolsheviks were living in huge gold-encrusted mansions and, living it up with their radio and their Charleston, then, yeah, the Ukrainians would have every right, not just to, resist them, but to destroy them. I mean, clearly. But when they're living in starvation, when they're, working themselves to death, both the Bolsheviks and the workers and the unions and everyone, in order to stop the white advance, that has a really different moral character to me. And it doesn't necessarily have to have a really different moral character to everyone, but it does to me. So, I mean, I think I've laid out my position. Have I, do you think, sufficiently laid out the Ukrainian position? I mean, it doesn't, I'm a partisan. I'm engaged in history and I'm political.
I mean, it doesn't have to be resolved entirely.
Yeah. And so I just don't want you to feel like you're not having a say or that, I'm attacking anarchism. I'm attacking anarchism as practiced in the Soviet Union. And I want to be clear about that, and I want to give anyone who has objections, I want that voice to be heard too. And again, InfoShop has a really good really good thing on Kronstadt from an anarchist perspective.
I'll check it out.
Alexander Berkman, although again he's a primary source, like I said, primary sources from this entire period are not reliable. But he has an interesting take on it, and it's a pretty common anarchist take. So I would recommend checking that out. But yeah, any other questions, objections? You got a hand, Chris?
Well, the thing I was going to say was, even during World War I, right, when the initial uprisings were taking place, it was over bread, because the cities were still starving, and that's why the Bolsheviks said, hey, we're going to give you peace, we're going to give you land, and we're going to give you bread. So even under the Tsar, people were still starving. So it's not like, oh, it was so good under the Tsar, and then the Bolsheviks somehow lost that sort of touch. So I don't think anybody really tried to support that position.
Yeah, I don't think anyone's defending
Okay.
Zardom.
I gotta go by the way, guys, but we'll see you next week, I guess.
Yeah,
I'll call you tomorrow about that
Yeah, sounds great.
conference stuff.
Any other objections, questions, clarifications? Comrade Rob?
Not tonight.
Tonight. All right, well, thank you very much.